Hello everybody and welcome back to another video from PowerDirector Made Simple. Today's video comes from a comment and suggestion made by a viewer, Paul Rushbrook, who has his own YouTube channel at the link shown on your screen. Be sure to check his channel out and give him some views. Anyhow, Paul wanted to know the following. Have you ever done a video on editing a video with clips of different frame rates? Well, the answer is yes, all the time. Here's some information that you might find helpful, but I have to warn you, there will be math. First of all, there's no such thing as the best frame rate. So I'm not going to try to give you an answer to the question of which frame rate is best, 24, 30, 60, or even 120. And while we're here, let me put your brains at ease by saying whenever you see a fractional frame rate, such as 29.976, just pretend it's a whole number, such as 30 frames per second. There are some very technical details as to why there is a minute difference, but it's mostly over my pay grade, so I'm not going to go there in this video. When recording the video, it's the type of footage that mostly determines at which frame rate the recording should be made. Hollywood-type movies and many TV shows with their desire to emulate real-life motion or the so-called cinematic effect tend to capture film at 24 frames per second. Live broadcasts, such as news and sports, are almost always shot at 30 frames per second. When it comes to anything higher than 30 frames per second, then that is mainly used to create slow motion video, record video game footage, or to record fast-paced sporting events. But now, when it comes to editing clips obtained from multiple sources with different frame rates, how does PowerDirector handle this, and is there any downgrade of the resulting video? The answer is yes and no. The real answer to that question lies in your preference settings, and your choice there, once again, should depend upon the type of footage that is being used, and what is the predominant frame rate of all that footage. For example, if you have 5 clips that are 30 frames per second and only one clip that is 60 frames per second, then it's best to make your time-based setting as 30. Otherwise, those 5 clips at 30 frames per second on a 60 frame per second time base will result in a lot of duplicated frames, which will produce a much larger file size. That might, and I repeat might, make a visual difference in how things will appear. Now, once again, the amount of motion in the footage will be very important as to any perceived downgrade in the video quality. There are 2 types of situations that can occur when mixing footage of different frame rates. The first situation is using footage recorded at a lower frame rate in a project set at a higher frame rate. The second situation is just the reverse, that is using a footage with a higher frame rate in a project set to a lower frame rate. Because of time restraints in this video, that second situation will be shown in a follow-up video, which means we are about to discuss using lower frame rate footage in a project set to a higher frame rate. Let's first take a quick look at how you set the time base for your project in PowerDirector. Some of you may not know that you even have a time base setting for your project. Pay close attention. I'm going to click on the gear icon at the upper right to open up Preferences. I'll make sure that I'm on the General tab on the left side, and then find the Advanced Settings option about halfway down on the right. On the item for Timeline Frame Rate, there are several choices available. I believe the default setting for North American versions of PowerDirector is 30 frames per second. This is probably a good general purpose setting, and unless you have a video recorded at 60 or 120 frames per second of race cars, sporting events, or video games, it's then that you might want to change the timeline to 60 frames per second by clicking on the down arrow. Now, right now, I'm going to get slightly weird and change mine to 25 frames per second. and then close the Preferences window. Over in my media library, I have a 4-second long source clip recorded at 25 frames per second entitled Forest Flyover. I'll drag down this video onto the timeline. Notice that it remains 4 seconds long and my project time base has been set to 25 frames per second, which means it has 100 frames of actual video. Now here comes that math part. That's 25 times 4, which equals 100. And you thought the math was going to be difficult. Unfortunately, PowerDirector does not give you any direct means of telling you how many frames are in a clip on a timeline. You have to do the math yourself. At least you're not using DaVinci, where its Fusion module insists that there are only 99 frames in this. Not even the true 100, but 99. How it manages to lose one frame is unknown, and the DaVinci people just don't ask. When I hit play, you can watch it play in the preview window. Now you tell me if you can see anything wrong. Everything looks perfectly normal to me with the video quality. But now I want to double the time base for the timeline from 25 to 50 frames per second. Now here is where PowerDirector has a slight advantage over the big boys in that this procedure is very simple to accomplish. Even with a video currently on my timeline, I can still go up to the Preferences, General tab, Advanced Settings, and then select 50 frames per second. I'll close Preferences. That's all there is to it. Back down on the timeline, my clip is still 4 seconds long, so even if there were any audio with this clip, the audio would not have been affected. I'll play the clip once more and you tell me if you see any differences at 50 frames per second. It still seems smooth, but something must have changed, right? Well, think about it. You have 4 seconds of video at 50 frames per second. That's 4 times 50, which equals 200 total frames of video. I know the math is getting a little harder, but stay with me. Where did those 100 extra frames come from? The good news is that PowerDirector has automatically created those 100 missing frames out of thin air. The bad news is that you had no choice of the methods that can be used to create those frames. PowerDirector merely took the easy way out and just duplicated a previous frame at set intervals to bring it up to a total of 200 frames. In this case of going from 25 to 50 frames per second, every other frame would be a duplicate of the previous one. Didn't know that, did you? Now the same thing would happen if you place a 30 frames per second clip onto a 60 frames per second timeline. Now we can take a frame by frame look at the video and we'll actually see those added frames. I'm going to start at the beginning and manually press the period key to advance one frame. Every time I notice no change in movement, that means it's a duplicated frame. So I'll hit M to mark the clip at that spot. So here we go. Forward, no movement. Forward, movement. Forward, no movement. Forward, movement. Forward, no movement. Forward, movement. Forward, no movement. This gets tiring after a while, so I'm just going to delete this clip and move over another copy of the same clip that I have already marked out where the duplicated frames occur. Every blue clip marker that you see signifies an added frame that is just a duplicate of the previous frame. Now that's a lot of blue clip markers, isn't it? If I hit play now, you know when the duplicate frames are going to be seen, but can you perceive any difference? By increasing the frame rate from 25 to 50, I did not add any video detail. I merely added duplicate frames to a clip recorded at a lower frame rate. Now, if the original source clip was recorded at 50 frames per second, then yes, there could be a smoother movement of the camera. Now, most of you, and myself included, probably think that the video looks just fine, even with the duplicated frames in it. But I know there are some self-proclaimed expert videographers out there that just can't stand the idea of duplicated frames being in a video, and they insist on using Adobe Premiere Pro or another high-end video editor in which they get to choose how extra frames are added by one of three methods of time interpolation: frame sampling, which is what PowerDirector uses, frame blending, or optical flow. So here is where PowerDirector starts to show its lack of high-end professional editing capability, because it is missing these options. In PowerDirector, you just don't have a choice. All you get is the frame sampling, in which the previous frame is duplicated to create the next missing one. But don't worry, folks, unless you are creating movies for Hollywood or doing some high-resolution product commercials, for simple home movie editing and most YouTube video creations, the frame duplication method will not downgrade your video as you perceive it during playback. The important thing to remember is that the type of footage that was recorded might show some objectionable differences. In the case of the forest flyover video, it is difficult for the human eye to see all those duplicated frames, and the human brain just pieces them together as one fluid motion. Now, if all these numbers don't have your head swirling just yet, let's try some more. I'm going to select from the File menu a new workspace, which effectively clears out my timeline. I then am going to go up and change my project time base from 50 frames to 60 frames per second in the Settings menu. In my media library is a file called Countdown, with the image of 59 appearing on it, which apparently is a 60-second countdown video recorded at 30 frames per second. I'll right-click on the file in the media library, and you can see that it is 30 frames per second and it has a duration on the timeline of just a little over 1 minute. As I close the Properties menu, consider this question. With my time base set to 60 frames per second, what would happen to this video clip if I drag it down onto the timeline? Because the timeline is twice the frame rate of this clip, would it be shorter than 1 minute or longer than 1 minute? If you answered either way, you just weren't paying attention in the previous example. The correct answer is that it would still be the same exact duration. Changing the frame rate of a clip does not change its duration. I'll now drag the file down to my 60 frame per second timeline. And take note that the duration is still the same at just over 1 minute. And just like in those previous examples, it is now twice the number of video frames because the timeline frame rate is twice at which the clip was originally recorded. To keep the math simple, I'm going to assume that its duration is exactly 1 minute. So the original footage has 60 seconds times 30 frames per second for a total of 1,800 video frames. When placed on the timeline, which has twice the frame rate, the new formula becomes 60 seconds times 60 frames per second, which equals 3,600 video frames. That means that 1,800 frames have been automatically added by PowerDirector, and each one of those frames is just a duplicate of the previous frame. I'm going to hit play, and you be the judge if this looks choppy or has a lot of stutter to it. Nope, everything still looks fine to me. Maybe my brain is just in slow motion, but I couldn't tell if there were any duplicated frames. Now, one other point to make in PowerDirector. I'm going to delete the file on the timeline. I'll now select the file directly in the media library and watch it play directly in the preview window. I am playing the original file that was recorded at 30 frames per second. It is not on my 60 frame per second timeline. So, as it now plays in the preview window, at what frame rate is it playing? 30 or 60? This may surprise you, but just previewing the file directly from the media library will display the video at whatever the frame rate of the timeline is set for, and not at its true recorded frame rate. If the timeline has a different frame rate than the clip, then the timeline or the project setting takes priority. And because PowerDirector gives you only one preview window, it will always preview a window at the setting for the timeline frame rate. I could prove that right now by advancing frame by frame through the preview window, and you'll find all the duplicated frames, even though the video is not on the timeline. At least Premiere Pro gives you a separate preview window for the source footage and a different preview window for the timeline, or sequence as they like to call it. And one final thing that maybe some other longtime PowerDirector users may wish to comment about. Did you notice that even though my timeline was set up for 60 frames per second, when I dragged down a 30 frames per second video clip to it, I did not get a clip mismatch warning that I believe we used to get? When did they take that out? So unless you check your video file properties ahead of time, you may not know if you have a mismatch of frame rates. You could be adding duplicate frames, or you could be dropping frames, as we'll explore in the next video, in which I'll show what happens when the recorded footage is at a higher frame rate than the timeline. In most cases, it's bad. Whew! We finally made it to the end. That was a lot to absorb, and the math part just gave me a headache. Now hopefully you got the idea. Even if there are duplicated frames added, it's what's in the footage that will determine if there will be any downgrades to the video quality. You just have to try and see what works and what doesn't. Thanks to all for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you've learned a thing or two. Please hit like and subscribe, and I invite everyone to leave a comment below. I'll see you next time.